During one of many terrible childhood incidents, Harriet Tubman suffered a brain injury, lost an enormous amount of blood, and was still forced to go work in the fields the next day. But with the injury, she also lost a lot of the ability to feel fear and began to have visions she believed from God. In 1849, she fled slavery, declaring it was time for liberty or death. If she couldn't have one, she'd have the other, and took her first trip on the Underground Railroad. But less than a year afterwards, the U.S. passed the Fugitive Slave Act, proclaiming all escaped slaves had to be returned to their masters whether or not they were in a free state, leading to vigilante slave catchers abducting children and free citizens to sell them southward whether or not they were fugitives. Canada was now the only place to be free. Harriet rerouted the entire Underground Railroad and began making trips back and forth, bringing enslaved people to freedom, risking herself thousands of times, never losing a single fugitive, all with a huge bounty on her head. At last, the Civil War began, and Harriet was asked to create an official spy network for the Union. With her intel, she proposed an armed takedown of an enemy outpost via a river planted with highly explosive mines floating just under the water. She led the Union safely through the waters, burned down the plantations, and freed hundreds of enslaved people, devastating the enemy. After the war, she was a famous American hero, but the military refused to ever pay her for her service. I feel like Ida B. Wells' career is always downplayed, so here's an idea of how badass she really was. Ida grew up during the Reconstruction period of the US. After the Civil War, whites were very resentful of any black person who wanted education, property, or to do anything to move upward in society. Tension was high, the KKK was getting bold, and what was called mob law started to appear in the South, running prominent black citizens out of town to prevent them from gaining roles of leadership. Worst of all, lynching was growing ever more common. Lynching is the practice of murder by a mob for an alleged offense. The smallest rumor could ignite a white crowd against a black citizen. They would be shot, dragged, and hung. This is all going on, and Ida is working as a journalist writing about racial injustice. She was not afraid to make enemies and was very bold in encouraging her race to fight to preserve their newly won rights. When a mob murdered 3 men working for a black-owned grocery store that was doing better than the white one in Memphis, Texas, she wrote, "Lynching is an excuse to get rid of people of color that were acquiring wealth and property and thus keeps the race terrorized." At her powerful words, thousands of black citizens moved and the economy left behind crumbled. Her journalism then found focus on the topic of lynching. A common excuse for lynchings was the accusation of rape by black men. Interracial relationships appalled the white community, and black boyfriends of white women were often victims of this fate. When Ida pointed this out in her paper, the white population was so incensed they destroyed her office, and Ida had to flee for her life. At incredible risk to herself, she began documenting lynchings in detail, traveling to investigate them, getting accounts from eyewitnesses, and proving they were done falsely. But as it is still today, this was a topic people wanted to ignore, and white papers like the New York Times continued to insist that black citizens were rapists and that Ida was a liar. Nevertheless, her work got the attention of the public, and an anti-lynching bill was finally introduced in 1918. Not many people know Frida Kahlo was planning on becoming a doctor. She was 18 when those plans changed after she got on a bus headed home from school in Mexico City. The bus was T-boned by a 2-car trolley, bending it into a C shape until it shattered into thousands of shards of shrapnel. Frida was found completely naked, laying in the street covered in blood and gold. The shrapnel had ripped her clothing from her. Someone had been carrying a bag of gold gilding powder which exploded and coated Frida, sticking to her blood. An iron bar had shot through her stomach and come out between her hips. She was taken to a hospital. Her spine, collarbone, and ribs were broken. Her pelvis was broken in 3 places and her right leg in 11. Frida would never be without pain for the rest of her life. She would require several emergency abortions and undergo 32 surgeries. Recovery took weeks, so her parents set a mirror above her head and created an easel she could reach. She was handed a brush and Frida began to paint. Hollywood's history of racism is no secret, but what do you know of the issue of yellowface? This is May Wong, Hollywood's first American Chinese star, born Wong Lusong in 1905 LA. She dropped out of high school at 16 to pursue her dreams of acting. At the time, lead Chinese roles were all played by white actors in yellowface. Similar to blackface, it included exaggerated costumes, crude makeup, and their eyes taped to pretend at being Asian. But despite getting cast in small roles, Anna's acting skills were amazing, and she was quickly recognized for her talent and beauty. Directors wanted to capitalize on her growing fame, but confined her to roles as demure Madame Butterflies or manipulative dragon ladies. A huge disadvantage to her career was Hollywood censorship, which prevented any actor from kissing another character outside their race, so unless they gave the male lead to a Chinese man, she never made female lead. So, as white actors took lead Chinese roles, she was pigeonholed into over-sexualized and unsympathetic side roles. While white America ate up her performance performances, Chinese critics called her a disgrace to the Chinese race. Caught in a world rejected by China for being too American and by America for being too Chinese, she lived torn between two cultures. Hollywood still has far to go. The blatancy of yellowface has been replaced with its more subtle cousin, whitewashing, which is when white actors are cast in originally Asian or any POC roles. Anna never stopped acting and fighting for better representation. Her survival and success in a racially segregated world speaks to the incredible force of power that she was. Ella Fitzgerald originally wanted to be a dancer and was going to call herself Snake Hips Fitzgerald. The famous Apollo Theater in Harlem had begun a new amateur night, and on a dare, Ella entered her name. She thought there wasn't a chance in hell she'd get randomly selected, but you guessed it, her card was drawn and she was going to dance. At this point in her life, Ella was 17, without parents, had run away from a cruel school, and was now living practically homeless in New York. She's backstage at the Apollo, about to go on and losing her nerve. Now, the Apollo Theater homed one of the most vocal, rowdy, and merciless crowds. The audience would let you know exactly what they thought. If they liked you, they loved you, but if they didn't, a man would catch you with a long hook and drag you off stage to a chorus of booing. Ella's now completely lost her nerve, and she turns to flee, but a friend pushes her on stage. She stands there, a deer in the headlight, her hopes of dancing gone. People begin to laugh and someone yells, "What the hell is she gonna do?" And then Ella opens her mouth and the audience couldn't believe it. The first lady of song, queen of jazz, Lady Ella was born, and she would go on to become a legend. Hey y'all, today I'm painting Audrey Hepburn. These are the photo references I used. Audrey Hepburn is of course at the top of most lists when you Google the most beautiful woman of all time, but I want to tell a story from when Audrey was a girl. She was 11 and living in the Netherlands when the Nazis invaded and occupied. For a time, little Audrey's life in school continued normally. The only difference was her Jewish classmates and teachers disappearing. Also, Audrey had to change her name in order to hide the fact that she was a British citizen. She became Etta and was strictly not to speak English outside of the house. As the Dutch citizens learned what was happening to their vanishing neighbors in concentration camps, rebellion and resistance grew until the Nazis cracked down. In response to a blown-up train, Nazis publicly executed 5 prominent Dutch citizens, one of whom was Audrey's uncle. The war was suddenly very personal, especially when soon afterwards Audrey's brother turned 14 and thus qualified and was taken to work in a Nazi slave labor camp. Audrey joined the resistance. She'd smuggle ration vouchers in her lunchbox and held silent dance performances to secretly support the Jewish families hidden throughout the city. Because of her ability to speak English, she was used to meet British spies and intelligence agents, giving them information and direction to their safe houses. One day, when she was on her way to meet a British spy, along came a group of Nazi soldiers. She quickly gathered wildflowers, and when the soldiers approached her, she gave them each a little bouquet and completely distracted and charmed them. They left in peace, and she was able to meet the spy. At 15, her town was blown up. The Nazis knew it was harboring English soldiers from a recent air raid. They told the townspeople to leave and then just blew it to pieces. Audrey spent the next year scrounging for food and avoiding capture by the Nazis for their slave labor camps. Holland was liberated on her 16th birthday. She had been barely surviving, was incredibly undernourished, and near starvation. Her metabolism would never be the same again. But she had survived the war and would go on to become one of the most beloved actors in Hollywood history. In 1976, an assassination attempt was made on Bob Marley's life. Not everyone was happy about him popularizing peaceful beliefs. Jamaica at the time was a battleground for warring political parties. Streets of Kingston were flooded with guns, markets were bare, and the city suffered under the tension of an approaching election between the Jamaican Labour Party and the Democratic People's National Party. Both desperately wanted the support of Marley, but he deliberately remained neutral. Instead, he organized a free concert called Smile Jamaica. It was a battle for the soul of the nation, meant to have no political overtones, but in a strategic move, the Democratic Party changed election dates to coincide with the concert, turning it into a rally for their party. Assassins were hired to kill Marley 2 days before the concert took place. He escaped with his life, suffering minor injuries, and still appeared on stage to perform. The shooters were tried, and supposedly one claimed that the CIA had paid them in guns and cocaine to kill Marley. Marley moved to England and there produced the albums Exodus and Kaya to huge commercial success. He changed the world not only by bringing reggae and Rastafari to a global level, but with his politically charged songs that advocate for positivity, unity, and change. 2 years later, he returned home to perform the One Love Peace concert. On stage, Marley called up both leaders of the warring political parties, and at his request, they shook hands. It was an amazing moment for peace in Jamaica.